tonight is sort of a special event, and because we've been virtual, it's been pretty awesome. We've been able to invite some speakers from outside of the Twin Ports area, and tonight is such a night. And so, yeah, and as soon as I saw what Shelby was up to and that she had recently, as you picked up maybe at the banter at the beginning of this, Shelby is a recent PhD graduate. And as soon as I saw what she was doing and what she was presenting on, I was really excited to ask her to come and talk to this group and share what she's doing. And so we're really happy to have her here tonight. As I said before, sort of the flow will be, Shelby's going to tell us some information. We'll have some time to discuss it, and you know, hopefully we'll all learn a bit of stuff and have a good chance to talk about it. So, yeah, so that's the general format. I will go ahead and introduce Shelby in just a second here. So, yeah.
Do you want me to go ahead and share screen?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Just so there's something.
All right. Yeah, you can go ahead and get that pulled up. Yeah, so as I said, well, actually, I didn't say this yet. So Shelby and I guess we are academic siblings. Is that how that works then? So,
yeah.
So I know Shelby from the University of Tennessee, and as I said, she's a recent PhD graduate down there in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. We were some of the last students to be mentored by our graduate advisor down there. And so, which was really nice. So for many years at the University of Tennessee, I had there was no lab, there was just me, and it was great. But as soon as Shelby and one of the other folks came in and joined, it was really nice to have at least a couple other folks in our lab meeting. So, and shortly after I left, Shelby got into this work, which is obviously really relevant and really important right now. And a bit about her. So, so she did her undergrad at Rhodes College in biomathematics, and has sort of studied a bunch of different things. So her PhD was at University of Tennessee in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and uses a bunch of different techniques. She's into spatiotemporal modeling, which we'll see a little bit of, some Bayesian stats, some quantitative social science work, which again is sort of here. And although she's in Knoxville, her outdoor activities would make her right at home in the Twin Ports. So she's an avid outdoors person and runner. And I believe she's run some pretty intense marathons recently. And so, yeah, really excited to hear from her tonight. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Shelby and ask everyone to sort of mute and get your videos off, and we'll hear from her now.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nate. As he said, I'm Shelby, and this is going to be very informal. I want it to be informal. I want it to feel like we're all sitting around a table at a coffee shop, brewery, whatever floats your boat, smoothie shop. I'm not picky. So I actually just this week started a job at Guidehouse, which is a federal and commercial consulting firm out of DC, but I'm working remotely. So if anybody wants to talk about the consulting world, I have 3 days worth of experience I can tell you about. So yeah, I first want to do some acknowledgements. First, thank you all for being here, and thanks to Nate for inviting me. It was really cool coming into a lab with an older graduate student such as Nate to really help me out and to at least show that people could get their PhDs. Sometimes you come in and it feels like an insurmountable task. And so I really appreciated Nate being there and giving guidance during my early years. I also need to acknowledge our advisor, Dr. Louis J. Gross, and then my committee members, Nina Pfefferman, Sergey Gavrilets, and Suzanne Linhart, as well as the Nimbus Investigative Workshop that I was lucky enough to co-organize in 2019 on the mathematics of gun violence. So this is the group of experts that we brought in order to look at the quantitative methods that have been used with gun violence in the past and to highlight some areas where we needed more research, where we needed more data sets, et cetera. And then also just acknowledging my home department and my funding. I was initially funded through the Program for Excellence and Equity at Research, in Research through the University of Tennessee. And then I was funded through the National Defense Science and Engineering Graduate Fellowship, which is technically through the Department of Defense. So that was a really cool fellowship to receive. These slides are all available on my website. And so, you know, if you just want to type this into your search bar, you can, or there's a QR code that you can scan, and the slides are up there. There's also seminar bingo on that homepage. So if you get really bored, go play seminar bingo, and I welcome you to do that. There's also more information about my research. So in the page with these slides is further information looking at some of the more technical aspects of the work that I've done. This is just an overview of kind of how I'm going to run the talk. I'll introduce myself, talk about the motivation of this research, go through the presentation outline, and then I'm going to present these 3 different questions that I would love for us to all discuss together before I go into some of the conclusions and my future work. Here's my personal introduction. So yeah, I got my BS in biomathematics from Rhodes College. I was the 2nd graduating class of biomathematics majors there, which meant that it was very interesting to watch a major be developed while you're hoping that it's going to be developed and doing all of the prereqs. And if anybody wants to hear about the biomathematics curriculum that I carried out at Rhodes, please let me know. My undergraduate research was an agent-based model of the Santa Cruz Island fox, but my start was in tuberculosis modeling. I got my master's in statistics at the University of Tennessee while I was doing my PhD, and that master's project was based in statistical analysis of diabetes covariates. And then I got my PhD, and the dissertation topic was on spatiotemporal models of gun crime in Chicago. So what this kind of means is like I have a very wide amount of knowledge about a bunch of different things, but I don't think of myself as a particular specialist in anything. I'll have someone be like, well, you're an ecologist. Do you know what this tree is? And I'm like, it has leaves. That's all I can tell you about it. But if you want to talk to me about Bayesian subset selection, I can dive a little deeper into that. All of that is to say is that despite the fact that I have a master's and a PhD, I do not feel like an expert in anything. And so that's kind of, what's leading me to want to put on a talk like this, where I hear everyone else's opinions on some of these questions that I asked during my dissertation research. So I do want to introduce quickly, the problem of gun violence in the United States. Annually, gun violence costs the U.S. $229 billion. It leads to the death of 36,000 individuals and the non-fatal injury of 85,000 others. Homicide is the leading cause of death in Black males aged 10 to 24, and 75% of these homicides involve the use of a firearm. So in 1993, Arthur Kellerman, who oddly enough graduated from Rhodes before it was Rhodes, when it was still Southwestern, he published this paper while working for the CDC that said having a gun in the home increases the risk for a homicide occurring. And it was met with a lot of pushback. And so in 1996, the Dickey Amendment said that no federal funding could be used to promote or advocate for gun control. By the CDC, similar language was put into the NIH funding appropriations. And so what we've seen, which you can see a little bit in this graph down here, is that while gun violence has a similar mortality rate to that of motor vehicles, the number of publications that are done on it is very small. And so this is kind of what led me to be interested in this research. Then I did a literature review, as many of us do in our PhD, and found that, based on these major questions and these 6 different mathematical and statistical models that I defined, we have these very visually obvious gaps in the literature that, still could be filled. And so if any of you have graduate students or you yourself are looking to do some work in this field, there are many open questions to be asked. Outside of the cost to the United States, I also want to mention the individual cost of gun violence. So adults who reported exposure to gun violence as children show an increased likelihood for chronic health conditions as well as risky behaviors. And so that's just exposure to gun violence. That does not necessarily mean that these children were a victim of gun violence. That could just be seeing it in your community. But this has, a 9.2 risk increase for ecstasy use and a 6.5 risk increase of the use of substances during sex. And so we're seeing that it's not only a cost to the United States overall, and it's not only a cost of life, it is also impacting the health outcomes of our children who are exposed at a young age. Because my research was on Chicago, a lot of my results are going to be based on Chicago. So I have to talk about gun crime specifically in that city. So there have been past studies that show this kind of epidemic property of gun crime in, Washington, D.C. I did a study using similar methods on the Chicago data and saw that similarly, there's this both, this clustering and this diffusion of gun crime in both space and time in Chicago. But particularly between 2015 down here and 2016, there was a 68% increase in gun crimes in Chicago. And this disproportionately affected disadvantaged neighborhoods. And so the main data sets that I used for this study are this Chicago City crime data set and this data set of selected socioeconomic indicators in Chicago, because we did see this large effect on disadvantaged neighborhoods. I do want to talk a little bit about the origin, my own origin story of this project. So in 2016, my second year of grad school, I was taking a math ecology course. For those of you with math ecology backgrounds, we were using Mark Cott's book, which may be the bane of my existence, but that's okay. And as a class project, Lou, my advisor who was teaching the course, wanted us to do some kind of full semester project, and we came up with creating an epidemic model of gun violence in the United States. And this is an old screenshot that I found of our, initial notes that we were taking on this. So we were going to use this SEIR model and then add in some randomness through stochasticity, and then eventually apply optimal control theory to think about optimal policy creation. So this was initially a group of probably 12 of us, and then, class was over. And that summer, a few of us were like, yeah, maybe we'll continue it on. And then people kind of dropped off to do their own research, and it just became my dissertation project. So eventually I did a little bit of a redirection, and rather than using this SEIR model, I decided to use spatiotemporal modeling to observe the epidemic spread of gun crime in Chicago. And while I'm not going to necessarily talk about that spatiotemporal model, that was the final chapter of my dissertation and was a lot of fun to do. So what I'm going to present to you is these three major questions. And this is kind of my overall plan for this presentation. I'm going to introduce the problem that we, came up with for one of my chapters or one of my sub-projects of my dissertation. And then I'm going to pose the question to the audience, and then I'm going to open the floor for discussion. And gun crime and gun violence and policy and all of this can be very sensitive topics for people. So I just want, a house rule is that all discussion must be civil and respectful. Nate has already said that he'll serve as the bouncer if anyone gets out of hand. But I want, what I want the discussion to be is based on what you've seen in the news and also in your own communities. What do you think the answer to this question will be? And you can talk about your own specific community. I don't, expect you to know anything about what's happening in Chicago unless you do know what's happening in Chicago. But one thing that I noticed is I am a white woman living in Knoxville, Tennessee, studying crime in a city that's, a plane ride away. So, I can do all of the data analytics that I want and all of the modeling that I want, but I don't know what's happening on the ground there. I don't know, what all is leading to this. And so I don't want to say that I am the expert in this when I don't know what's happening on a person-to-person daily basis. So after we have some of this discussion, then I'll present my results. These are just some participation guidelines from our Mathematics of Gun Violence workshop, in that it's just going to be unacceptable for anyone to get particularly catty or to, harass anyone in the chat or verbally. And I'm hoping that, Nate doesn't have to bounce anyone out, but, I wanted to put in place a little bit of a code of conduct before the discussion begins. Okay, so introduction to question 1. On March 26th of 2020, I got a text from one of my friends in Chicago that, he just asked, has the shelter at home, policies, has they changed my data? Because he thought that Chicago had gotten more dangerous. And at the time, I was just stopping at 2018. I wasn't looking at 2020 data. So I had no clue. But I thought this was interesting. And we, had a little bit of a conversation about the potential mechanisms. A few days later, I had a meeting with Lou, and I brought it up just in a passing, in a passing way saying, this sounds like an interesting thing. I wonder if you have any ideas about it. And then, he was like, we should write a quick little paper on it. And so on July 31st, our first manuscript attempt was submitted to Science. Spoiler alert, we did not get a Science publication out of it. But my overall academic takeaways from this is that, research ideas can really come from anywhere. And a quick little paper is never quick, as many of the academics in the room likely know. You come up with an idea, you're like, oh, that's a simple analysis. It'll take us 3 weeks. And then suddenly it's been months or years or whatever else, and the paper's still not out. So this quick little paper that I thought was going to take me a month ended up becoming another dissertation chapter for me, which is really cool. And I really enjoyed getting to do that work. So, I wanted to know, what was the impact of the pandemic on crime? Specifically for Chicago, on January 24th, they had their very first case. On March 9th, they declared a state of emergency. And then on March 21st, the stay-at-home order was implemented. So, I'm about to open up for discussion in the chat, or if you want to unmute, but, in the initial time period, we only looked at the first 2 weeks after the stay-at-home order was put in place. Do you feel like crime changed? I mean, what were you all looking at in your own communities? What did you all see in your communities or on the news? And then do you think that there were different types of crimes that were impacted in different ways than other crimes? Did burglaries change versus home invasions versus domestic violence versus, motor vehicle theft? So at this point, I'm going to open it for discussion. And yes, for each discussion, there is a terrible stock photo of people having a discussion. So feel free to jump in or be in the chat about some ideas you might have.
I guess I'll volunteer to do some ice breaking. Super interesting so far, Shelby. I just gotta throw that out there. I'm really enjoying the presentation for many reasons, but the first thing that comes to my mind is something that is maybe not directly related to just these initial stay-at-home order time frame. So maybe this doesn't fit with what you're asking for. But of course, here in Minnesota, as of a year ago, Tuesday night was the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and that led to a lot of uprisings in the city and that sort of level of crime. And I think ever since then, a lot of folks who live in the Twin Cities have talked about increased crime rates, and there's sort of this back and forth about it being related to reduced policing because people are asking for it. And so there's all of these social factors that are based on these, social justice issues that have arisen because of that. So I would maybe venture that it's more related to those incidents than specifically to COVID stay-at-home order. But I think that the attention and focus that was given to the issue probably had a lot to do with the time frame with COVID, that everybody was so tuned into the internet and all of those sort of things. So it's kind of hard to parse those things out separately. Like, I think they are, intersecting factors. So I would hazard that this type of movement toward just more recognition of issues of racial equity might also have impacted crime rates in Chicago. So that's the first thing that came to my mind. And again, may or may not really fit in with what you're asking. But
yeah, no, that absolutely fits in with what I'm asking. And yeah, because we were only looking at the 2 weeks after, we didn't incorporate the summer of unrest is kind of how, I phrased it. But, there are multiple reports out there that have shown at least anecdotal evidence of this increase in crime, during the summer and things like that. And yeah, I think there's an interesting intersection between increase in crime during, the protests, but then also maybe lack of policing because there's this, police aren't wanting to get in trouble. And so there's this really interesting social dynamic in play that, kind of happened last summer in crime dynamics. So yeah, that's a great point.
I'm curious for the answer. I'm staying quiet to give other folks a chance to get in here. I guess I will take a stab right now. So, although I did just say I'm staying quiet, I can't stay quiet for too long. All right. So my thought is, my initial thought would be that crime would probably like decrease as more people were staying home. Like just in general, I just assume that, you know, like the less people are out and about and whatever, like that maybe that influences things. In terms of like, you know, the types of crime, that would be really interesting to you know, and I'm curious to hear what you found, but like yeah. And so and I would guess that things like, you know, home invasions and things like that would probably go up more potentially if that's where crime needs to, if everyone's in the house, like that's where crime might need to happen. So those would be my guesses. I'll throw those out there.
It's not letting me, hang on, there we go, it's scrolling, sorry, I gave it away and then I couldn't figure out how to scroll down anyway.
There was something in the chat too, Shelby. Did you? Oh, go ahead.
I haven't checked the chat yet. I didn't know if you wanted to strictly moderate or whether I could co-moderate with you.
Let's co-moderate.
Yeah.
I'll take this one.
Okay.
So 2 things in the chat. I'll take the first one. If you see something and I haven't addressed it, get in there. All right. So from Kelsey Vitens, I could see crime like burglaries potentially increasing if people were out of work as a result of the shutdown. So, okay, that's an interesting thought to share there for sure. Followed by that, Sarah Mikesell, hopefully I've said your name right. I said they assume crime in the community went down, but domestic abuse issues increased. Not sure if those are reported though. Yeah, that's also, yeah.
Yeah, so those are both really good points. And somebody else entered the chat as I was. Potentially if neighbors are home, those domestic abuse might be more reported. Yeah, so these are all of the questions that we were asking when I brought up this, you know, thing that legitimately my friend just, you know, sent me a text saying, hey, has this changed your data at all? And so, you know, what we ended up finding was that, and this is a comparison between 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. So, you know, 2017, 2018, and 2019, they've got a, you know, some noise, but they generally follow the same trend. But then in 2020, in terms of, you know, the temporal timescale, we saw that, you know, crime was initially, this is total crime, crime was initially staying kind of steady or at least predictive of previous years, and then suddenly just dropped off. And this was a significant decline. And so, you know, we did see that there is this, you know, there was this big difference in the time preceding stay-at-home orders and the initial time period, those 2 weeks right afterwards. And so then we were also curious about, you know, what types of crimes, as many of you brought up. And so we broke them down into interpersonal, statutory, and property crimes. And the post stay at home, so, and then pre stay at home are, you know, in different colors here. And significantly different ones are starred. And so, you know, we did see that these very, you know, sharp declines between pre and post occurred in more of the statutory and property crimes. We did see a decline in criminal sexual assaults and regular assaults, but all of the points that you each brought up, you know, kind of play into this. It's kind of like, well, you know, maybe home thefts went down because if you're at home, nobody's going to come and rob you when you're sitting in your house. And, you know, maybe robberies went down because people weren't out and about, you know, robbing different businesses. But, you know, what you all brought up with the interpersonal crimes, it's, you know, we did see some declines here. But interpersonal crime is the category that showed the least amount of categories that, least amount of crime types that showed these significant decreases. And that could be for, you know, a number of different reasons. It could be that because you're not going to work, you maybe don't have access to a trusted person outside of your home that you can tell that you're experiencing domestic violence. You know, it could be that, you know, these were reported and cops were called, but due to COVID concerns, they didn't want to go into an apartment. And so they just, you know, did a conversation through the door and then never fully kind of explored the rest of the crime. And so we did a similar analysis of Baltimore and Baton Rouge, and we saw very similar patterns in both of those cities as well. So, it was kind of, at least across these three cities of differing sizes, we did kind of see these similar patterns in that, right after the stay-at-home order was put into place, we saw these decreases in crime. And it was mostly in the statutory and property crime categories rather than interpersonal crimes. And there are obviously more questions to ask, as was brought up at the very beginning. What did the summer of social unrest do to these numbers? Did it actually go up significantly, or was it just in such stark difference from what we were seeing in, late March and early April that it seemed like it was a sharp increase? So again, just there could be a cool little study that somebody could do, seeing what happened after a month of the stay-at-home order, or 2 months of the stay-at-home order, 3 months, etc. And I'm happy to take, more questions and more discussion on this at this point, or I can move on to the next one and we can discuss it further later on. Okay, I'm not seeing anything pop up in the chat, I don't think.
Yeah, there was just a couple of things in the chat that came up after we sort of started talking, and it sounded like you addressed them. But I say let's keep on trucking here.
Sounds great. Okay, so slightly, on a similar thread, thinking about how time impacts crime, there are all of these claims about these temporal patterns of gun crime in Chicago. When I started doing this research, I set up just a Google News alert for the term gun violence. And so every Wednesday I would get my weekly digest, and it would be all of the news articles that occurred over the last week that included the term gun violence, which, if you're in the research world, is a great thing to do so that you kind of know what's going on in the media. I also have one for my name, just in case, somebody with my name becomes a serial killer, and then I know to, clarify that it's not me. But there are, multiple claims about how these temporal patterns exist in gun crime in Chicago, and nobody had really tested to see if they were statistically true or not. So, the two questions that I wanted to ask is whether there were true variations in crimes over years, and then over months, and then, over specific days. And the initial question was whether certain holidays showed higher or lower numbers of crime than others. So those are kind of the two questions that I want to ask. And this is specifically gun crime, which is not only gun violence events, but any crime that occurs with a gun. It could be an armed robbery where no one is shot, but that's just the weapon that is used in order to intimidate. So and now I will reopen it for discussion and ask, do you see patterns in your own communities and when you feel like violence is occurring, or does it seem like it's steady over, over different months and years and seasons? No, the chat's popping off. Doug, that's a fantastic question. We don't have perpetrator data in our data set. So, I haven't looked at the, the racial patterns of either victims or perpetrators, but that is a really interesting question. And then Kim is, saying that it might be more likely to happen during summer months. And it seems like, it's all happening during the summer. Brenda agrees with that. I'll give it a minute or two more just to see if anybody else wants to jump in. So Glenn, I'm assuming that's a comment about the previous question involving the COVID and crime dynamics. But I was going off of the publicly available data set. And so, I don't know that I had access to fraud against the government or, wage theft. But those crimes would be really interesting to look at as well.
Yeah.
Nate, do you have any ideas?
No, not on any of that stuff. Yeah, it seems like sort of the consensus here, the hypothesis here is sort of the seasonal effect of, especially for, especially for us folks that are pretty far up north, there's a pretty dramatic difference when, it's negative 20 degrees outside and not. So yeah, interesting to think about where, sort of those differences that happen sort of across the country based on, climate and things like that. And yeah, more questions coming to my mind than answers at this point. But yeah, thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts in there for sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just saw a comment about Christmas season crime going up,
Yeah.
and the evidence was Home Alone, and that caught me a little bit there. So yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So well, go ahead, Shelby, please.
Yeah. In terms of Doug's question, I'm just going to answer it really quickly, but I don't gang violence. So, the data that I have is just about the type of crime. It doesn't say whether it was associated with gangs or not. And so, that may be something in there. We thought about using data from the Gun Violence Archive, which does do more text data mining of news articles, and then that may have some of that in there. But I wasn't as convinced that the data collection methods were, I wasn't as confident in the data collection methods that Gun Violence Archive was using. And so I wanted to use kind of this publicly available data set from Chicago. Okay, I'm gonna shut down reading the chat because I'm gonna get off on a number of tangents, and these are all things that we can open up after I'm done with this part of the presentation. But yeah, we're gonna have some real chats about this stuff because y'all have great ideas. Okay, so to answer the question about whether there are yearly patterns in gun crime, we were just using t-tests here, and so we were looking at Chicago gun crime from 2001 to 2018, and it basically follows with what you see visually. So our significantly higher years were 2001 and 2002, and then 2016, 2017, and 2018 over here, while our significantly lower years were in this dip of 2013, 2014, and 2015. And so Sherry Towers, who just left Arizona State, but is a fantastic researcher, she wrote a really interesting paper looking at whether this spike in 2016 was due to what she called the Ferguson effect. And so, after the Ferguson incident, there was kind of, as we were talking about in the previous question of, what did these increased tensions between police and citizens kind of do to crime? And in at least her analysis, she did not see that the Ferguson effect was the cause for this uptick between 2015 and 2016. But there were a number of other societal events that occurred in 2015 and 2016 that could have caused this sharp increase. So again, some really interesting studies to be done about mechanisms here. Looking at the monthly patterns in gun crime, again using t-tests, February has significantly lower crime than other months. And I want to be clear, this is average crimes per day. I had the same moment when I looked at the data set of, oh, it's because February has 28 days, but I had corrected and normalized over the number of days in each month. And yeah, in Chicago, it's cold. Nobody's out and about. So yeah, Nate, what you were talking about with this kind of seasonal variation very much holds in this data. But interestingly enough, we don't see that the summer months are significantly different from, the average in here, which I found to be really interesting because, again, you get these news reports about summer of violence and all kinds of things. And then we wanted to see if there were specific daily patterns in gun crime as well. Is like the second Tuesday in March a really heavy high gun crime day, or, is there some odd day in September that no crimes really occur? We were just interested in doing this kind of outlier analysis. And then we also wanted to do more t-tests and to actually look at these specific holidays and see if some of these news reports, rang true in the actual data. And so we looked at New Year's Eve and then New Year's Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day, Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. And, in these media reports, I see a lot of like Memorial Day violence leads to this, or Halloween violence leads to this, or, shockingly quiet day on Christmas in Chicago. And so what we ended up seeing is yes, there are these trends, there are these holiday patterns, but it's not necessarily as strong as the media reports. There doesn't seem to be patterns in which days came out as the outliers. So there's not that second Tuesday in March or anything like that, seemingly. We did see that New Year's Day shows significantly higher crime, while Thanksgiving and Christmas show significantly lower crime. But when we extend this out to more days rather than the very specific day, a lot of these patterns end up dissolving. So we're not seeing that the days surrounding New Year's Day are significantly higher, or the days surrounding Thanksgiving or Christmas are significantly lower. Once we kind of extend it out, we're seeing that it kind of dissolves. And one thing that is interesting is that, the data set that we're given, it defaults the date, or we imagine that it defaults the date to January 1st if the date is not put in or is not put in correctly. And because we're seeing this like very high number of crimes on New Year's Day, and it could be that a lot of crimes occur on New Year's Day, but also, in an Excel file, if you put empty, then it may just default it to New Year's Day, which is potentially causing this, higher crime. So that's all to say is that it's important to kind of know your data and to interrogate your data to make sure that what you're seeing is actually happening. And so then, I'm going to move on to my third question. And I imagine there's some discussion going on in the chat. So, if it's for the previous question, we can go back to that at the end of the presentation. But it may be all of you having these discussions on your own. You may not even need me. So because we saw this, large effect between 2015 and 2016 on, disadvantaged areas of Chicago, I kind of wanted to know which socioeconomic conditions impact the number of gun crimes that occur in Chicago communities. And so I, did this negative binomial regression, Bayesian negative binomials regression with subset selection. And I tested the factors of crowding, poverty, unemployment, education level, the percentage of the community that is dependent. So that is individuals below the age of 16 and over the age of 65. So that's the percentage of the community that is not of working age. Or that's at least how the census data or the American Community Survey cites it. And then also per capita income. So yeah, the next question is which of these socioeconomic factors do you think might contribute to gun crime and why? So again, now we open it up to discussion. Home Alone was a lie. I'm glad that we all know that Home Alone was a lie.
And just put a sort of a space in there. So if we go back through the chat, we can sort of picture, where we're at with the questions and stuff. I'll answer this one right away and just say, I think it's hard to imagine that not every single one of those is a factor that's influencing these things, and that many of those factors are sort of correlated together in their own right. And so, so that's mine, all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I did a multicollinearity analysis, and I was very shocked at the fact that a lot of them did not show multicollinearity with one another. Again, floored by that, because per capita income and, education, and I just assumed that they would all be really interlinked. But yes, I can go up to show the factors. Poverty and per capita income were not as closely related as, I thought. Kim is asking how you measure crowding, and I believe that is the percentage of households in the neighborhood with 4 or more people living in one house. I believe. I may be completely off. It's been a while since I've looked at how crowding is measured. Can you clarify what 2 things you're asking about being related? Oh, the people in the homes. Because it was census data or American Community Survey data, I think it was just how many people live in your home. And it may be how many people live in your home versus the number of bedrooms that are in your home. So that may be what crowding is. And I'm glad to look up, the specifics of how they measure that crowding, if you're interested.
Anybody want to venture a guess as to what they think maybe the factor that contributes the most out of these, the most significant factor?
Substance abuse issues, yeah.
Hmm.
What about just income inequality? Yeah, so the data set that I have is socioeconomic conditions. There is a measure for just what's called the hardship index. And so that kind of combines all of these factors into this one index. But of course, that was correlated with all of the other factors, and it was causing issues in the subset selection. So I removed that for this, but hardship is an index that is calculated. I don't know whether that captures in your mind, Brenna, the income inequality, but there is this overall, this overall index of the hardship in a given community. And then, yeah, physical substance issues, I didn't have that data available to me, but, or it may be available to me. I didn't use that data in my analyses, but yeah, I agree that would be really interesting as well. All right. Some other things may pop up in the chat, but I'm going to answer this one. And so in this negative binomial regression with Bayesian subset selection, we found that the factors that popped out were poverty, unemployment, and dependence. And poverty and unemployment are positively correlated with the number of gun crimes that are occurring, while interestingly enough, the percentage of the population that is dependent is negatively correlated. And so, this was really interesting because in at least my opinion, poverty and unemployment, I sort of expected, but I still am not sure of the mechanism behind why dependence, the percentage of the population that is, dependence, might associate with the number of gun crimes. And, I've talked about this with social scientists, and there's, the idea of grandparental care, that if you have, a high proportion of the over 65 population, then it may be that young children who may get caught up in things like gang violence then have, a caretaker if their parents are working all day or something like that. So still not exactly sure what's causing that. So yeah, again, that's something that we can discuss if people have ideas surrounding that. And so, with that, I'll just talk through the kind of general model conclusions, which is that, in terms of COVID-19, crime declined in the first 2 weeks following the implementation of stay-at-home orders, but the changes were mostly in property and statutory crime rather than interpersonal. We also saw this in Baltimore and Baton Rouge, but I didn't test it in other cities. In terms of the temporal patterns of Chicago gun crime, there are some patterns, and we do see that there are significant events that impact gun crime patterns, but there's some inflation in the media about how impactful particular days are or particular months and things like that. And then the question about which socioeconomic factors contribute to gun crime and why. Poverty, unemployment, and the dependence are significantly correlated with the number of gun crimes in each community, but we're really not sure about the why. And again, I would love to hear people's opinions and their thoughts on it. And so then just some overall research conclusions. Gun crime and gun violence are major public health concerns in the United States. And there's both a lack of research on it and a lack of research funding. And so this is something that is slowly being reopened to the NIH and the CDC, but there's a great need for more of this research to occur. And there are also far more factors that contribute to gun crime outside of the availability of guns. I personally chose not to think about gun availability in this, and that was somewhat for my own personal safety being in Tennessee. But people, when I talk to people about gun crime, they're like, so how do you feel about the fact that I own a gun? And I'm like, we're not going to get into that because, I am far more interested in what we can do in specific communities in order to stop the underlying mechanisms that are producing gun crime. And by, stopping those underlying mechanisms, also improve quality of life rather than just debating with someone about the Second Amendment for an extended period of time. Overall, everything about this is really, really complicated. And so while creating evidence-based policy would be the overall goal, it may not be easily accessible. And so part of the reason why I bring this up to this, diverse community of people outside of Tennessee and outside of the gun violence research field is because in order to find the optimal solution to reducing gun violence, we need to work with researchers, which could be epidemiologists, sociologists, criminologists, public health practitioners, psychologists, also mathematicians and ecologists. We all count too. We also need to, talk to non-academic experts. So that may be those in law enforcement, public servants, and policymakers. But then most importantly, it's important to talk to the community members themselves. Oftentimes, people in the community have far more of an idea about what's going on in their community than researchers applying right away. And so by talking to these cultural leaders, community leaders, past offenders and potential offenders, which I could go on a rant about strategic subject lists, but if we do find communities where we do see a high percentage of offenders going in and talking to those groups and kind of asking, like, what do you think is happening in your community, and what can we do to make it better for you? What can we do to produce better outcomes for you? So just overall, like, we need a large population of people doing this work, both on the ground and in the lab and at the policy level. And so with that, I will open it to questions and also discussion. And I think we've got like 7 minutes, but I'm also down to go over to talk about things.
Well, thank you, Shelby. And yeah, for the folks that are comfortable, if you want to, feel free to turn on your video if you want to share your video and we can talk about this together. Don't do it if you don't. And but otherwise, yeah, does anybody want to ask a question right away? We do have some sort of lined up in the chat, but now would be an opportunity to sort of voice your question out loud if you'd like to. So we have some stuff continuing to come into the chat, and yeah, please continue to ask questions in there. So yeah, so let's see. So I think in terms of the chat, there's a couple of different questions. There's still a couple things left over. The most recent question came in. It had to do with ethnicity in any of the neighborhoods that you were looking at and stuff like that. Do you want to address that at all, Shelby?
Yeah. So for my spatial database, I basically just looked at community areas, so it wasn't block by block. And while I think I could have had access to the breakdown of race and ethnicity in those community areas, that wasn't something that I observed. So while that may be correlated with the number of gun crimes, that's not something that I necessarily looked at. You can't look at everything. So I was just doing what I could with the data I had available.
In terms of data availability, so you towards the end, you mentioned that some of the data is becoming more available now. Was there any particular, and I wasn't aware of necessarily the history of it, which you touched on at the beginning, which was sort of saying what I took that as was there was a study that came out by the CDC that said that gun ownership increased the likelihood of, there's a positive correlation with homicide based on gun ownership, and it sounded like maybe the fallout of that was to have a bill passed or something that said that the CDC and the NIH could not research these things. Was that the history? So I guess so this is maybe a little bit of a broader question, but if you wanted to, maybe you could give a quick recap of sort of the history of data availability. If I've done that justice, great. And then sort of what's changing and where your data came from and stuff. I know there's a handful of sort of data scientists in the talk right now, and I'm sure we'd be interested in from that aspect to hear that. So that's my question.
Yeah. So again, in 1993, this Kellerman paper was published and just said that, and it was a fairly simple correlation study and showed that having a gun in the home increases the likelihood of a homicide occurring in the home. And, I think at the time there were a lot of congresspeople who were funded by the NRA, and the NRA was not happy with the fact that this paper came out from CDC funding that said that, don't buy guns because you may have an increased risk of homicide occurring. And so, yeah, then the Dickey Amendment was passed, which, basically shut down research, or did not shut down research, but shut down these two major groups from doing it. And also, even independent researchers couldn't get funding for the work that they were doing. So even if you were writing a grant to the NSF knew that the CDC and the NIH couldn't do this research, and they were worried about the federal fallout from funding this research. And so we just kind of saw this decline. So, now a lot of the research that's coming out and a lot of the data availability is from, local police departments. So Chicago has their crime data publicly available. Baltimore has their victim-based crime data available. Baton Rouge similarly has it available, but you never know the quality of the data because there's not consensus on how that's collected. And so, Chicago has a very different method of collecting the data than Baton Rouge does. And so is it appropriate to directly compare those two if they have these different methods? And then a lot of the work that's being done is by, more private foundations. So the Arnold Ventures is doing some of the work and is funding some of the work out of RAND. And then there are a number of other, private groups that are doing some of this, but they also feel some limitation. So, there is kind of this need, and Jay Dickey, who was the, presenter of the Dickey Amendment, he's come back and he said, like, I don't want this amendment to be in place anymore. Like, I want gun violence research to be opened up again. And they just can't get the amendment removed or re-amend, or, somebody with more of an experience in government and policy can tell me the correct term for that.
Yeah, that's crazy. Thank you for sharing that, Shelby.
Yeah. So do you want me to go through the chat, or do you want to go through the chat, or, Yeah. Okay. And if I miss someone's question, feel free to repost it below. The dip in 2018 due to a snowstorm. I was not in Chicago in February of 2018, but that could be a reason. If somebody wants to do a historic, data search of weather in 2018, then there may have been a snowstorm. It would be cool to see. And then that's the gang violence question. Any changes in the disposition of the firearms used, legally obtained versus stolen? Again, that data is not data that I have. The Bureau of Alcohol, it's changed names, but we're not allowed to know how many guns there are in the US, and we're not allowed to know where they came from. So a lot of the data sets that are used for gun availability are developed through proxy measures and things like that. And it's very frustrating to do this work and not be able to know the answers to those questions. And then, yes, the presidential regimes during those years is a really interesting thing. What I wanted to do was at some point to see what specific federal and local policies were put in place and how the temporal changes occurred due to those changes in policy. But I only had, as much time as you have in order to do that work. But I do think that would be really interesting to see how implementation of particular policies changed in those, minute ways. The spike may have been due to a recession. I was 8 in 2001 and 2002, so I'm not exactly sure what was happening then. But it could have been due to a recession. That's a good point. And then, the decrease from 2003 to 2015. People have brought up a number of different reasons why this may have occurred. Some people talk about, the fact that it could have been due to the administration. Some say that it could have been due to the, things that were going on in the Chicago area. I know a lot of these interventions were put in place in the early 2000s. So there were like community-based interventions that were put in place. And so by, 2013, 2014, 2015, a lot of them were a decade old and had kind of become stale within those communities. And there had been so much turnover in leadership that they weren't being kept up as well as they had been previously. So that could be part of it. It could be due to, local government things, federal government things. But yeah, Doug, that's a really interesting question. database. In terms of the suicide question, there's not a clear separation of suicide from incidents counted as gun crime, but because this is a crime data set, I don't know whether the police record suicide as a crime and put that into a data set. I imagine that that's recorded in a different data set because there is no crime code for self-inflicted homicide. So I'm thinking that those are not included in this data set. Okay. And then I'll go to Doug's question and then I'll hit Dan's and then Angela's because I also want to be cognizant of time. Was there a change in social conditions during the declining period? Was there a change in policy? I will be completely honest, I did not look at the very specific policies that were passed between 2003 and 2015 in Chicago. If any of you know of those policies, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. But I do imagine that there were some things that occurred in Chicago between 2003 and 2015 that could have caused that decline to occur. It also may have been, again, going back to the data question of maybe things were coded differently. Maybe the law enforcement policies were different. Maybe that leap in 2015 to 2016 was a change in the way that crimes were coded. Maybe it was a change in the patrolling, policies and things like that. So there's so many factors that can cause these patterns. And I'm still trying to, go through each of these patterns. Okay, so Dan, to your question, were crime rates more responsive to the factors you observed in some neighborhoods than others? Yes, so there were differences in the particular communities about whether it was, poverty, unemployment, things like that. In the higher income areas, there's obviously less sensitivity to a lot of these factors overall, or there just was less sensitivity to these factors overall. But the community areas are fairly large. And so they are kind of heterogeneous a little bit. You do see these, areas where there are spikes in gun crime and that those are correlated with, high levels of poverty and high levels of unemployment. So, we did see some interesting patterns in that. And then Glenn, asks a question about lead levels, and the whole lead and crime correlation has always really interested me. From a like outside of science, outside of my professional research realm, and so I would be really interested to look at that. And then so Angela asked whether I plan to continue to research gun violence. I would love to eventually get back into some of this. Right now I'm a new baby data scientist, baby senior consultant at this new firm. And so while I would love to, bring this in to my consulting job, right now I kind of just have to take what they give me and go with it. And we'll see whether I can eventually, bring some of my past research in.
I'm glad we're all okay with sort of extended moments of silence here. I appreciate that. Gives people a chance to jump in when they want. Okay, another question just came in here. So did you do any comparisons of gun sales and crime rates?
Nope, because we can't have access to gun sales data. No researchers. Well, I imagine there are some researchers who can have access to that, but they are people who work specifically for the federal government. So no, we don't know anything about crime sales. I mean, we know some stuff about crime sales, but it's all proxy measures and all proxy data.
So I'm curious. So like I said, I recognize that a good amount of the folks in here tonight were probably drawn to the quantitative aspect of your research and in the title. And so for those folks, would you share a little bit about some of the techniques? So a little bit of technical talk for a moment here, some of the techniques you're using in your research.
Yeah, so some of it was, I will say is boring. T-tests are not boring to everyone, but T-tests are kind of boring to me. So a lot of the temporal analyses were just, simple comparison T-tests, some outlier analysis. I really loved the Bayesian subset selection model. So first of all, thinking about the assumptions of regressions and of data fitting and realizing that my data was not normally distributed, and then trying to figure out how to encode the priors and the posterior distributions and a bunch of these other functions for a negative binomial version of a Bayesian subset selection. So for those of you who may not be on, on the technical side, the subset selection process that I used took all of those factors and took, the number of crimes that were occurring and iterated through every combination and permutation, and then created this value that was, called the information criteria value. And quick aside for people on the technical side, I ran it over, I think, 7 different information criteria, and then picked the lowest of those. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to reduce the error in the fit. So you're trying to figure out, what combination of factors best fits the data that I have. So yeah, that subset selection process was really fun to write the code for. And by fun, I mean, it was type 2 fun, in that it was not fun at all, but it gave me some cool stuff. And I thought the methods were really interesting. And then, yeah, my very final chapter is a cellular automata model. And so if any of you have dealt with agent-based modeling, these cellular automata models are spatial and temporal. So they've got the space-time component in there. And it's kind of looking at how this epidemic of gun crime spreads throughout an environment. So there are all of these layers within it of, the socioeconomic conditions and of the, initial gun crime. And then there's this infectivity parameter that shows how quickly crime is going to spread from one area to the other, and there's stochasticity in it. And then we look at how, multiple iterations of this model show different dynamics, and we look at the sensitivity of the model to different parameters. And so, I think my overall dream for that model was that I was going to be able to say, like, okay, if we want a 20% reduction in gun crime, we need to apply this intervention at this time and in this location, and then we're going to see that reduction. And unfortunately, grad school has to end at some point. And so I had to kind of accept where it was at for the dissertation. But, to Angela's question, I would love to eventually go back and do this kind of optimization and potentially even optimal control on a spatiotemporal model, which is just wrapping my head around that still blows my mind. But I would love to kind of add some of those more complex methods layered onto the cellular automata model that I created.
Well, yeah, thank you for sharing that. For the folks that are not the data scientists or the math folks in the room, thanks for hanging on there while we while we indulged a little bit with Shelby here. Yeah, so I guess maybe we can have one final call for questions, and then now would be a good time to maybe call it a night. So yeah, we had another one come in. So
yeah, so Jan is asking whether the number of dependents could be a reflection of the age distribution of the population. I didn't look particularly at mean age as a factor because, again, I only had these selected socioeconomic indicators or distribution. I realized that you were talking about age distribution. Again, I don't have the perpetrator or the victim data. This is just for the community as a whole. But yeah, what I would be most interested in knowing is whether the the community areas with lower numbers of gun crime, whether the dependence is coming from the upper end or from the lower end. So whether it's more individuals below 16 or whether it's more individuals above 65, because that may, elucidate some of these observations we're seeing. Yeah. Yeah, an increase of married people without kids and more young adults moving back home. Yeah. Well, and so then, you know, there's also the considerations of particular neighborhoods and what's the norm in that neighborhood. What's the cultural norms that are playing into, you know, what all of the kids under the age of 16 do after school every day. And, you know, do the grandparents move in fairly early with the, you know, with the children, with the younger generation for, you know, in order to get care. So yeah, there are some really interesting cultural and social questions that come into play, you know, when thinking about this dependence question.
Well, so I'll take the final question then, and this is more of just to hear a little bit of sort of your story as a scientist. So I like to know, and I like to ask for the group here, if there's sort of a moment where you decided like, this is the kind of science I want to study, this is where I want to go. You know, was there some sort of moment? I mean, biomathematics like is a pretty, you know, as you said, you were one of some of the first people to sort of do that major there. And so like, yeah, just curious, like if you could share a little bit about how you got into the science that you're into now.
Yeah. And like, so this is a story about mentorship and why mentorship is so important. So, you know, I grew up in you know, in a community outside of Birmingham, Alabama. So I grew up in the South, and, you know, at career days, you never really saw one. I never met a scientist, somebody whose, you know, job title was scientist at a career day. And then if I did know a scientist, it was an older white man. And so I was fairly good at math and science, and I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon. And then, you know, I got to college and I was like, all right, I'm getting a biology major. I'm in Memphis. I'm going to, you know, shadow at St. Jude, and I'm going to, you know, shadow at all of these hospitals. And then I'll go to med school, and here are my med school programs I want to go to. Like, I had it all planned out exactly in my head. And for the biology major, you had to take an intro to stats course. And so I'm in this intro to stats course, and I'm just, you know, being a teacher's pet. And so the professor would bring up a formula, and he'd be like, but we won't go through the derivation. And I'd go up to him afterwards and be like, oh, is this the derivation? Like, honestly, just trying to show off for my college professors. And, you know, at one point he kind of looked at me and he was like, how much math experience do you have? And I was like, well, I took AP calculus. And he was like, and how'd you do? And I was like, well, I got 2 5s on the BC test. And he was like, I don't care what you say. You're taking Calc 3 next semester. Like, the professor who's teaching it is great. And the professor who was teaching it was Erin Bodine, who is also innate in my academic lineage. And so she got her PhD in math from Lou, our advisor at the University of Tennessee. And she just saw my potential as a biomathematician. She took me to my first conference. She, you know, gave me, I have 2 first author publications, one of which I got in 2014 when I was a junior in college. And so she just kind of saw my potential and saw my promise. And she never said, hey, you don't actually want to be a doctor, you want to go into research. Like, she really let me reach that conclusion on my own. Which I think was really important. I don't do well when somebody tells me what to do. So having her say, you know, like, hey, you can figure this out on your own. And then having her support me through applying to graduate school and through my first few years of grad school was just, it was a game changer. So Nate, to answer your first question, I didn't know that I wanted to go into science until I was sitting there with my MCAT book in one hand and my agent-based modeling textbook in the other. And I was like, I think we want to go with agent-based modeling, and like just had no interest in medicine anymore. So yeah, that was when I knew I wanted to do science.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. Like you said, sort of the importance of mentorship and having people to even just share, like, this is a possibility. This is something you can do. Here's some interesting stuff is really important and really cool to hear about that. So, yeah. Cool. Well, I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap things up for the night here. I'm the only one off mute. I'll give you a quick clap from my living room here and just say thank you very much. Yeah, really, really interesting work. Thanks for talking the technical side. Thanks for, you know, obviously, like you said there, and everybody here throughout, and also a clap to everybody who joined in tonight too. Thank you for sharing and posting your ideas. You know, you've given Shelby a million new things to study when she does get back around to this, if she can. So thanks for coming out tonight, everybody. And again, Shelby, thank you, and congratulations on finishing up at the University of Tennessee, and good luck in your new position now.
Thanks. I appreciate it so much. And thanks to everyone. If you have, more questions, feel free to reach out. If you have a student who wants to do a project like this, I'm happy to give them all of my information that they can use to do the work I don't have time to do anymore.
And with that, we'll post this video. And then with that, we'll add links for, Shelby shared her sort of her GitHub site and a way to get in touch, and we'll post a link there. So for the folks that wanted to potentially follow up, I know there's a couple of educators in here too. And so you mentioned some of that stuff, and actually, yeah, biomath sort of education was one of the interests that you shared. So awesome. So anyway, we'll put information out so you can follow up. Again, thanks for coming out, everybody. Have a great rest of the night, and we'll call it.